Salutations from space and aloha from Earth, friends. It's wonderful to be with you here on this solstice day. So Merry Yule, this festival of lights. However you do it, I'm so glad you could spend some time here with me and a friend, Mark Elmy, who I've not connected with for a while. So, Mark, are you out there somewhere? Hopefully, Mark's still connected. There you are. Good to see you.
Hello, Brett.
Happy solstice to
I
you.
happy solstice to you as well.
So, friends that are here live, whether you're at Zoom or somewhere else on the YouTube page, we welcome you. Or if you are watching this at some time that I currently perceive to be as the future, we welcome you as well. Maybe some of you are time travelers and you've already seen it. I hope it was good or will be. We're here to talk times, a cosmic conversation with a timekeeper. And Mark and I don't know even how I found you some time ago, but I'm so happy that I have. And I'm wondering, Mark, because I know you hail from the UK, did you burn the Yule log when you were a lad?
Uh, no, I think, well, I mean, I don't want to dive in or preempt things too much, but I think that kind of like, um, one of the things that I think is missing from our modern society is ancient tradition. I think that we're very good at creating new tradition. I think that, kind of like we do that on a theory or whatever basis. But yeah, unfortunately, that wasn't really part of my reality as a child. And I think this is also maybe what spurred me to go looking for those traditions as an adult.
Yeah, it's fun to look for the ancient traditions buried in the modern traditions as well, right?
Yeah.
I've been spending a lot of time even just contemplating the four sides of the dreidel in this game of like you give a little or take a little or give it all or take it all. It really feels like sunrise and midday and sunset and midnight, or the seasonal correspondences of spring and summer and fall and winter, seeing that also, like the temple menorah had seven candles, and one, the central taller one, would stay lit by day. So that's the sun, right? And we've got the visible planets on either side. And yeah, I've been following Santa's sleigh in the sky and things like that because I really like interested in bringing more of kind of a mystery tradition to some of these things that I think we do without thought. But I have a friend from England who's a strong Virgo devotee like yourself, a very ceremonial fellow, great being. And yeah, he had this Yule log tradition, which I hadn't seen. I grew up in like Las Vegas, Nevada. I mean, we're pretty devoid of culture there. And but each family keeps their own thing. But it was really cool to see how we would process that. So I was wondering, I always ask people from the UK, hey, is that something you did too, or is my friend just special? So what did you do to celebrate solstice today?
Well, today I've been up since about 4:30 this morning, and I was down, just in case people haven't sort of like realized, I don't actually live in England. I'm here beside Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And I was up at 4:30 this morning to get prepared to make a solstice sunrise ceremony to greet the sun as it rose across the lake. Where I live kind of faces just a little bit to the south of east. So anything between March and September, the sun is occluded behind a hill at sunrise. So I don't really get to see it. But from September through to March, I get the full force of the sun rising across the lake. And the type of ceremony that I make is the Mayan fire ceremony. This is what I've been trained for, been working with for many, many years. And for me, just to give you an idea, today is the day 3 in the sacred calendar. This is about our inner path. And of course, for me, solstice, the winter solstice, as we would be observing here in the Northern Hemisphere, is about the return of the light. It's about the rebirth of the sun, as it were. And so it's after a period of darkness, going back into the light again. So kind of like I see like this solstice ceremony combining with this 3 day as a time to reignite and illuminate the inner path. That's what for me today's focus was about. And so that was how I started my morning. I had about 7 people here, and I don't know how many people on Zoom because I wasn't really paying attention to the screen. Of course, I was tending the fire.
I was
Um,
almost one of them. It was 4 a.m. here, and I had woken up at like 2 and like grabbed the iPad, but then I woke up at 6, so I just missed it. And for me, it was working a good amount with the midday sun today. There's a pine tree here, and so looking at how long the midday sun, how long that pine shadow was at midday, it's another way I'm going to kind of track the yearly energies. I'm really blessed with the house that I'm living at now. It's a different place than when you and I last connected. But I
um,
can see the setting sun every day of the year. So I've been
right.
taking a photo every month as the sun's moving through the tropical zodiac signs and, keeping time on the horizon, which is one of the old ways of doing it. But you've come to a very old way of keeping time and something foreign from the land in which you grew up. So, what was it that first brought you to the Mayan tradition and to Mayan time, Mark?
Well, I've been working with this calendar since January of 1998. And through a series of synchronicities, I ended up going along to a bunch of lectures in my hometown of Ipswich in Suffolk in England. And there I was at the beginning of January. And if any of you know what it's like to be 52 degrees north of the equator in the beginning of January, it is the darkest, coldest. You can see why people celebrated the solstice and the return of the light, because honestly, by this time of the year, you're done with like those late, sunrise at 8:30 a.m., sunset at 3:30 p.m. It's not a good time of the year. So I go along to this presentation where this couple start talking about this calendar, and up until that point, I knew nothing about the Maya. I knew nothing about really other systems of keeping time. What do you mean there's another way of counting the days? What do you mean there's other calendars? This is something that I suppose, there's that wonderful pie chart of, what you know that you don't know, and all of that stuff that you didn't even know that you didn't know about. Anyhow, I was, how can I put it, a young and wild mid-20s at the time. And these people started talking about this calendar, which was going to end in 2012. So I was sitting there and I was like, well, I'll probably still be alive at that time. Maybe I ought to find out something about that. Now, it turned out that they had this, for want of better words, Mayan shamanic school about 6 miles down the road from where I lived. And I was like, well, okay, I'll go along to it, not realizing that that was actually a really, really rare thing. And I went along and I started being taught about the calendar. And that was that. There was something that just got hold of me. And 15 months later, I'd quit my job, sold my house, and bought a ticket to Mexico.
And how did you find your way into connecting with calendar teachers and day keepers there in Mexico? And now you're in Guatemala, right? So, what was that transition?
Most of the time, it was like, for me, it's been certainly, obviously, like everything else, being in the right place at the right time, knowing where ceremony is going to take place, knowing kind of like getting in places. But I have to say, there's also been something which has been unusual for me. I think it's unusual anyway, kind of like just happening to be at the right place at the right time when something happens and thinking, hey, because I can't do the pressure thing. I'm not kind of like, I'd make a terrible like door-to-door salesperson. I don't go around banging on doors trying to get in places where I shouldn't be. I'm very much kind of like, let's say, maybe a bit times waiting for things to come to me. but let's say at least trying to put myself in the right position to do so. And so, yes, kind of like you get chatting to people, and it just so happens that that person knows that person who wants to take you to ceremony where you end up meeting that person. And it's just kind of like I took back in the mid 90s and late 90s. I took a lot of my inspiration from the Celestine prophecy and following the synchronicities and that kind of thing. And honestly, that has been one of my best teachers for, finding out where to be and finding out where to make myself. And I wanted to show you something. I guess it's going to turn into a show and tell. And I think that whilst I went through a lot of places in Mexico in the late 90s, it was really Guatemala kind of like 8 years later where I really started finding stuff, and where I found one of my main teachers here in Guatemala. And I went to an expo where he happened to be, and I didn't really realize that he was going to be there. And I took a question with me. And that question was in the shape of a model and what I call a three-dimensional map of time. And I'd walked with this for something like 10 years because I intuited it while I was while I was in Australia back in like around about the turn of the millennium. And I'd walked with it after that to try and find somebody who could explain it to me. And I ended up with this, which is how the calendar, the Mayan sacred calendar, translates into three dimensions.
So there's
And
260 squares on that cylinder.
exactly, yeah. This is all of the way that the calendar gets put together. This is something which is known as the Mayan cross. This is all 260 crosses put together.
Wow.
And I had this epiphany that they should go together somehow. And I was trying to work out how it was supposed to be. And so I started drawing them all out on paper, and like some kind of crazy person at 2 a.m. or something like that, couldn't stop. And then I realized as I got sort of like 7 lines down that what I needed over there was already up there. And the only way to make it fit together was to roll it together and bring it into a third dimension. Um, so I then went back to my original teachers and I said, "What is this? What does it mean? How does it work? Can you tell me about this?" And they're looking at me going, "We have no idea what you're doing there." And so, like I say, I took it to different elders around Guatemala, and it was there that, like, Don Rigoberto wanted to come and find out more about it. And so I had the honor, a couple of weeks after I'd met him, I get a phone call. Would it be okay for him to come and visit? And it's, this would be a wonderful thing. Thank you. I'm so honored. Yeah, cool. Wonderful. And that began our kind of like friendship and mentorship and that kind of thing. So um,
I
I
think
think
probably
mine's a
it would be
key.
a good time to just take a little bit of a technical breakdown for folks who have not tuned into Mayan time at all. And it's important for everyone to know that there were actually many, 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 many calendars kept. Actually, there's whispers that some of the calendars has still not been made, have been not still not been revealed to the public, I guess. Um, but the principal calendars and those that many of us kind of first learn about are what in the Yucatec language they call the Zolkin, yeah. But
Mhm.
in Quiche Maya, how what is the word for the 260-day count?
Chalk ik.
And so when you say
Okay,
it's 3A today, that's from this 260-day count.
correct. There are somewhere in about 16 or 17 different Mayan calendars, all of which are counting different things. The three which are most you might be most accustomed to. I'm just trying to find a kind of like a good example of this. What I'm trying to show you are the long count, the sacred count, and the solar count. Let me see if I can just find you a Stella. It shouldn't be that difficult. um,
I have
so,
something I could bring up on the screen too, Mark, if you don't find it,
okay,
but I
sure.
imagine you will. I have to search for an app, but there's this chalk app, which is pretty cool. It basically shows many, I think it shows the sulking and the hob and the long count kind of in stele form. So let me dig for that. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so the
So,
structure of the 260 days is these 13 numbers and then 20. Um, some call them day signs, or I know in Yucatec it's like Nahual, right? What's the
Wallace, yeah. So,
Nuales?
um, the reason why I kind of like mentioned the three is because whenever you go to a Mayan site, you will see those three kind of principal calendars encoded in stone everywhere you go, because we get three calendars which give us three different systems of time. Here we go. Here, let me show you. I know it's holding a book up to a camera, which is not, this is not the modern way of doing it. I should be able to like transmit some kind of PDF, and I don't know whether that helps at all. But what you see there, this is a stela, which shows us three different calendars on the same stone. Why are there three different calendars?
So let me
Well, I'm going
share
to
this
start.
also, Mark. I've got this is this chalk app. Did
There
that
we
show up
go.
on your screen?
That's perfect. Yep. Okay. So if you look, I think it's actually broken down there. It shows you the long count. It shows you the what they're calling the Tolkien, and then they're showing you the harp. Okay. And so I'm going to start by talking about the long count because this was what turned over in 2012. Okay. The long count, which consists of Baktun, Katun, Tun, Winal, and Kin. And using that, we can look up a date over thousands of years. The next calendar, the Harb, is a calendar of 365 days. And so that's going to renew. Well, we already were like priming about this with regards to leap years and stuff like that. But right now, the Harb is renewing. Well, the true Harb is renewing around about 30th of March, if I remember rightly. But here we have a slightly different count of it. And our solar new year is the 19th of February. We then have the Tzolk'in or Cholk-Ik, as it's called here, which is a calendar of 260 days, made up of 20 Nawales and 13 numbers. And this is seen as the sacred calendar. And so I think that, for me, the long count is very much a technical, mathematical calendar. It's very useful for a lot of things. But the sacred calendar is providing us with the information of what's in flow to do in a day. Okay. And this is what the Akihab, the day keepers, work with to help people to understand where to put the best foot forward on a day. That's really what it's about. I feel, and I'm pretty certain, that the role of both the sacred calendar and the Akik who keep it is to bring harmony to community, to bring harmony to people. And we bring harmony when we are doing the right thing on right days. So an achik is consulted, say, okay, what day should I start building my house on? What day should I start my business on? What day should I get married on? All of these kind of things, because there are days on which when it's a good day to do it and days when it's not such a good day to do it, which we're familiar with through astrology as well. There are days for this thing, days for that thing, days to just leave things alone as well.
And also
So
similar to Western astrology, it's said that the day of your birth will, in like the sacred time and where you were in the count of days at the time of your becoming, will also say something about your character and your energy and your mission in the incarnation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's your blueprint for life. It's your pattern. It gives you an understanding of the tools that you carry and the mission that you're on, the role that you are here to play in life. And, kind of like as we go through them, you look at them, and I don't know whether you look at this with regards to the sun signs or something like that. They're like, for me, the Nawalas are like 20 different characters. They're 20 different stars within the movie. And you got to ask yourself, well, what's the movie about? Is it a movie about a warrior? Is it a movie about a magician? Is it a movie about a lawyer or whatever it might be? But one thing's for sure, if the star of the movie is supposed to be an archaeologist and you're trying to be a lawyer, then he's not going to do very well at it. And this, for me, is about finding out what the properties of your Nawala are all about, because it helps us. We've lost touch going back to the old tradition, new tradition thing. We kind of like, we we got to play to our strengths, and our strengths have been given to us. And well, going back to the idea of keeping things in harmony, we are more harmonious within our society and with our home when we're doing what we're good at, when we're doing what we're naturally talented at. And so, if we're aligning ourselves with the powers and qualities of our Nawal, rather than kind of trying to fight against it by being something that we're not cut out to be, then eventually we're going to have a more harmonious life. And that has a knock on effect in the community around us.
And so it's good to know, right? And I mean, this seems to be
Yeah.
why Westerners refer to this as Mayan astrology, although it's a really different thing, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
Western system, I mean, it's wrong to think of it entirely astronomically based. We are working with cycles of sun and moon and the planets, and but there's a lot of kind of symbolic, intricate, somewhere deep in the matrix, who knows where it comes from, stuff in there too. And the Maya were some of the greatest ancient astronomers, and the Venus tables, the eclipse tables that were left, and considering especially that most of the books and texts from this incredibly literate and sacred culture were burned or hidden, or who knows. We don't have much of it to go on. But that which we do reveals just an amazing connection to the sky. However, this 260-day count, it's not necessarily an astronomical count, right? I mean, and there's a lot of great question of, well, what is it? And the ones I've heard is, well, it's kind of the corn cycle, or the cycle of the human in gestation. We're in the womb for about 260 days. Some have claimed for a specific latitude in southern Mexico, and I think this would be Guatemala as well, that it's the 260 days between the consecutive zenith passages of the sun. Um, but what to you rings true in any of that for this 260-day count, and this, I guess, these gears, as it's often shown, of 13 and 20? I just want to say something about that because this will be new to a lot of folks who are here. um, Many of you, most of the names I'm seeing are in the School of Earthstrology, and Western astrology so well. And we have this system of triplicity and quadruplicity. So the triplicities, or the trigons, or the groupings of three signs that these days we refer to as, fire and earth and air and water signs, right? Have a set of three, and then you have, or sorry, four elements, and then the quadruplicities are sets of four. So we have these three modalities, as we call them these days. And to use kind of the modern descriptions, you move from, I'll just do like four on this hand and three on this hand, right? I don't know if I can do this though. Let's see. I'm going to go that way. So cardinal fire, and then fixed earth, and then mutable air. And now we're out of our three. We need to start again, right? So you get to cardinal water, right? And with the three and the four, this gets a cycle of 12, right? So these are our 12 signs. Now it's a little bit more complicated when you're moving through, on one hand 13 fingers and the other 20, right? Or it's often shown so beautifully as these gears, the way that's so often depicted these days. Of Maybe you could just speak the names of a few of the day signs with numbers. Like, so here we are, today is
Okay. Yeah.
3-8, so tomorrow is
Yeah.
4, and the next day is 5. How does it go from here?
Yes. That's it. So we can see that there are many different ways that you can start a calendar. And actually, most calendars are all circular anyway. You know, it's like where you choose to begin and end. I mean, like for me, I think like astronomically, winter solstice makes a great start to the year. Astrologically, of course, we're looking at spring equinox. As far as I'm aware, anyway.
Well, a
Like,
lot of astronomers go there as well. I mean, it's the point where we measure celestial longitude and right ascension from, is that, from the tropical astrological point of view, the zero Aries point. But I think
yeah,
especially in lands far north, like the one from which you hail, as you were describing before, it makes a lot of sense to kind of work with the sun being reborn. And there are some
yeah,
astrologies, especially German astrologies, right? So folks who are living so far north in the snow and the cold during the winter time, who see the sun's Capricorn ingress, so kind of the northern hemisphere winter solstice moment as the beginning of the year, and work with that chart as a chart for the year ahead.
yeah,
It's a much more popular approach to work with the zero Aries chart, of course, spring equinox in the northern hemisphere.
yeah. So the reason I mention is we can start wherever we choose to start. We might start with one Imosh, or we might start with one Bats. And the way that the calendar works is, as you've said, we've got 20 Nawales, 20 essences of creation. They are actually kind of like they belong to four different families, which we could assign to the east, the west, the north, and the south. We could also assign them to, kind of like fire, the earth, the air, and the water. But really, kind of like when we're going through this, let's say the cycle of the Nawales could be seen as the bringing into the world of a new human being. And so we would start with Imosh representing the egg, and move to Ik representing the sperm, and move to Akabal representing conception as the egg and sperm come together, and then Kat, the implantation in the womb, Can, the spark of life that comes along and brings that little being to life, Kameh, the transformer, Kech, the wilderness, and then moving through Anil, Toch, Tzi, Bats, Ech, Ach, Ish, Tzikin, Achmach, Noch, Tihash, Kawok, and Achpu, which takes us to 20, which takes us back to the return to the source. Now, as you said, each of those days is numbered. So we've got our 20 Nawales, but we've only got 13 numbers. So if we start with one Imosh, we're going to go one Imosh, two Ik, three Akabal, four Kat, five Can, six Kameh, seven Kech, eight Anil, nine Toch, 10 Tzi, 11 Bats, 12 Ech, 13 Ach. We have now completed what is known as a Tresena, the Tresena of Imosh, and now we're going to begin the Tresena of Ish, and we're beginning that on one Ish. Okay, one Ish, two Tzikin, three Achmach, four Noch, five Tihash, six Kawok, seven Achpu, eight Imosh. Okay, so Imosh we've come back to the beginning of our count of Nawales, but this time, instead of being a one, it's now carrying an eight. And that cycle repeats. And of course, if you've got 13 numbers and 20 Nawales, neither of those numbers is divisible by the other. And so it will give you 260 perfect combinations before it then recycles. And so this number of 260 days, it's interesting. The calendar is said to be a calendar of the human being, a calendar of life. And I say that, well, in my experience, I think it's tied into much more than that. As you mentioned before, we have the Zenith transit, which here is on the 30th of April and the 13th of August. Now, I get all excited about that because we don't have Zenith transits where I come from, because it's way outside of the tropics. And how cool is it that there's 2 days of the year when if you go outside and stand straight up, there's no shadow. And so I take my tripod and I take my level and I level it all up in the middle and I wait for, well, it's actually 8 minutes past midday here because of the way that the lines of latitude works. And you see kind of like the sun come through this tube and being broadcast down this long, thin tube. So it just occurs at that moment on that day. Anyway, like I say, I get a bit excited about it. But you know what that's all about? It's all about growing corn. On the April transit, you are guaranteed the beginning of the rainy season. So you plant your corn. You've got 80 days for your corn to grow. You've then got a period of time for you to dry your corn and harvest it and prepare your field before 13th of August, before the second Zenith transit, when you have to get your next seeds into the ground in order to bring them to fruition before the end of rainy season in November. And so they're using the Zenith transits and the sacred calendar in order to know how to get the maximum yield of corn, which brings harmony to society because there's enough food for everybody to go around. Okay. So whatever, like that time between 30th of April and the 13th of August is 105 days. The other side of the year is 260. So this year, I believe that the 13th of August fell on the day 3 Ik. So we know when 3 Ik comes around again on the calendar, that's the time to plant our corn because the sun will be directly overhead at midday. Incidentally, if I remember right, the other day, I was taking a picture of the Pleiades and I was looking at something with regards to their naming. And in Kichean, the Pleiades are called mots, and this means the handful of seeds. That handful of seeds disappears. It sets at sunset in around about the end of April here. And this is like the handful of seeds that we're putting into the soil. So again, whether we're following the zenith or the calendar or the cycle of the Pleiades, this is helping us to know when we're going to get the most out of the seeds that we plant.
I saw that photograph, and it's cool to see your telescope behind you as well. I've been appreciating our love for the night sky that I know you and I share, and some of these great pictures you're taking. And that post was cool to see as well because you mentioned, the Pleiades name Subaru, which is used in Japan, and also how there's a different name up in the Yucatan, right, or Quintana which is corresponding rather than to seeds to the rattle of the snake, right? And it's
Yes.
said that there's a snake up there that has a pattern on its rattle that looks like the Pleiades. And yeah, so it's interesting that these zenith passages, which only happen in tropical latitudes. So if you're at the equator, it's on equinox day that the sun goes right overhead in March and later in September. I prefer to say it Aries and Libra. Um, if you're 20 degrees north of the equator, it happens at a different time. If you live on the Tropic of Cancer, when the sun ingresses Cancer, it shines above the Tropic of Cancer. Right? So the zodiac is a very astronomical thing. And obviously, there were many cultures practicing with the 260-day sacred count, and that were corn cultures as well that didn't have the gift of the 260 aligning to the local zenith passages, right? But there's
Yeah.
one at Chichen Itza, and I want to spend a little time there because folks who have been know that there's this really beautiful pyramid there, four-sided pyramid, as we often see in the Mayan lands, with a ramp of stairs on each side. And each of the stairs has cases has 91 stairs. So you add all those up and you get 364, and then there's the top of the pyramid, which is 365 for the days of the year. And that pyramid is aligned in such a way. I've just in March equinox of this year was able to see the serpent at that pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, which is so amazing. They've aligned it in such a way that and I should say constructed it in such a way that when the equinox sun is setting, both Aries and Libra equinox, but Libra equinox tends to be rainy season. So Aries equinox is the time to go. And it works like a week before and a week after. But the setting sun before it sets casts the shadow of one of these corners of the pyramids into the ramp on one side. And the effect you experience is this slowly undulating serpent shadow serpent projected onto that ramp. And it descends into a giant stone serpent head at the bottom of the ramp, who's said to be Kukulkan, or you may know a feathered serpent. That's Quetzalcoatl from a different language. And this was one of John Major Jenkins' theories, was that there's a time in the precessional ages when the Pleiades there at Chichen Itza will zenith, will like be right overhead. And so there'll be a time where this equinox also brings the rattle, the Pleiades in the heavens, so that the serpent is descending all the way down there. Now, earlier I corrected myself to say constructed in such a way for the shadow happening to go down, because the pyramid itself was aligned in such a way that the sunrise and sunsets on the two zenith passage day each year like aligned to the corner of the pyramid and then to the side of the pyramid. And I've just been playing with this. Like I realized basically you could do that with any square at that particular latitude, which is like 19 and a half north. So I'm gonna go test that in Hawaii next year. But so these zenith passages seem to be so key because it's one of the ways of keeping time. Like tomorrow morning, so many will wake up and go see the solstice sunrise at Stonehenge, right? Where the sun aligns through certain stones. And there was just this question in the chat. It's like, hey, isn't like solstice tomorrow because the sun's not in Capricorn yet? The sun's moving into Capricorn right now. And actually this morning in Guatemala and here in California was closer to the actual solstice moment than tomorrow morning will be. So this morning's sunrise was closer. But at Stonehenge, tomorrow morning's sunrise will be closer. So I'm not sure if it already happened yet or if it's going to happen, but a whole busloads of crazy people will go to experience that amazing alignment to the solstice sun. And it's different, when we live in these temperate zones or far from the equator zones and serious seasonal expression. Like one of the ways that we'll work with the sun, as I was describing before, like where it is on the horizon, which you can do everywhere. As Mark was saying, like he gets to see sunrise for like these 5 months, like when the sun is rising south of east, but once it starts heading east and then north of east, it's behind a hill and no sunrise. So I guess you get to sleep in a little bit. But other ways that we would keep the days is like a meridian calendar. So where I live and in all locations north of Earth's Tropic of Cancer, the sun souths at midday. And so casts a shadow length, right? And the longest midday shadow is at winter solstice because it's the lowest sun, and the shortest is at summer solstice. And so you can measure that lengthening and shortening shadow at midday to keep the days as well. But in the tropics, you have this special experience where the sun goes 2 days a year directly above your head. And I got to experience that in Hawaii this year for the first time in my life. And it's super trippy, right? And then the idea of like different ways of building sacred site to like light tubes, right? To get that overhead sun only in those 2 days to help you know where you are in the calendar. Because it's something we take advantage of these days with our magic boxes. I can push a button and a digital time pops up and it will tell me the date and, this calendar that I don't feel like I signed any contract, but it was given to me as the only one when I was born or whatever. And there's something to the Gregorian calendar and the way that the time that the sun spends in each of the signs. And that's interesting. I often encourage folks and say this happens kind of automatically when you come to astrology. If you're watching the sun through the signs, if you're celebrating new moons and full moons, then really you are realigning yourself to natural time, right? Because it's a weird thing to talk about December, whatever. So the last thing I'll say before we get back to this is at Chichen Itza, when I was there for the equinox happening, Everybody's waiting for March 21st, but the equinox was on the 19th. And so I was able to be there, and I took this time lapse and just chilled out, and there was like very few people there. I mean, sadly, they kicked us out of the site before it was over, before the sun set all the way. But a couple days later, it's like Woodstock in there, and it's like, crazy. So, and there was a friend from Mexico who came. He's like, "Well, why didn't we come on the 21st?" And I was like, "Dude, like this is the equinox." So we have these issues with our calendars as well. Like it's really odd in astrology where we talk about, oh, this the sun moves into the sign on the 21st or the 23rd. Well, why wouldn't that be the first? Why don't we have a design like that? And I think coming to any of the sacred calendars can really help us realign to sacred time and also help us honor the challenge of keeping the days. Because before iPhones and whatnot, right, you're either working with the sun, working with the lunar cycle, or in this sacred way of keeping these 260 days. And it's so cool to know that you live in a place where it will remind you where you are, remind you you're doing it right because of those zenith passages of the sun.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it very difficult to plan a garden, though. If you're in the northern hemisphere, you want to be like when you're house hunting for a house with a south facing garden, right? Because you want it nice and warm throughout the year and that. Well, here, like between 30th of April and 13th of August, the sun is in the north at midday, only a little bit. But all of those plants that were growing up that south facing wall are in shade for 3 months, which is kind of weird to get your head round if you've been growing gardens in the northern hemisphere for a while. But you know, it's interesting to see just how many of the Mayan sites are aligned in one way or another, albeit not as spectacularly as the Pyramid of Kukulkan. But we find what are known as E groups in so many places. Washaktun, just to the north of Tikal, has one of the most famous E groups that has been rebuilt several times. And what you have like a temple here, you say, and then over here you have a temple, sorry, a mound. Sorry, I'm not quite sure how I want to represent that on the camera. Anyway, this is your observation platform, and this mound has three small temples on it. Those temples are basically to the east, to the northeast, and to the southeast. And what you find is that when you stand on the observation platform, the winter solstice sun will rise over the southeast temple. The equinox sun sort of rises over the middle temple, though that one there's some errors within it. And then the summer solstice, of course, rises in the northeast. And when I've taken people there, I've toyed with the idea of lining people up by birthday on the long mound. Because we can see, yep, okay, that's where the sun is going to rise. You are the marker for your date of birth on that mound because it's easy to calculate. Now, the interesting thing is that I mean, I could recommend some books if people are into their archaeoastronomy and stuff like that. There's a wonderful book called Sky Watchers of Ancient Mexico by Anthony Aveni. Like that should be everybody's first port of call, as far as I'm concerned, for what the Maya and the cultures of Mesoamerica were doing with that. We also last year I had the honor to go to Tacalicapac, which is over in southwestern Guatemala, and there this was a meeting of the Olmec and the Maya, and what we find is two different systems in the same place. I got super excited about this.
The Olmecs
So,
kept the 260 days as well, yes? I mean, some say that
yeah,
was like the oldest culture that we're aware of that we're keeping the 260-day count.
it seems like it. And we can certainly see stuff about the sacred calendar going from about 500 BC. It seems to be the oldest calendar. But um, whether it was handed from one culture to another or how it worked out, I'm not sure. Okay. But the great thing about Takalika Back is you have two systems of showing celestial north. And one of them, the Maya system, is pointed towards what we call Polaris. And the Olmec star system is pointing towards, if I remember rightly, Eta Draconis. And what it's showing is that in the cycle of precession, the cycle of precession, we're always talking about, okay, sorry if I get terminology wrong, I'm not a Western astrologer, but that our sun signs are shifting, that the sun's in a different place to where it was a couple of thousand years ago.
Well, we said
But what also,
the signs are precessing through the constellations.
yeah, and what's also happening is that our northern celestial pole, as it wobbles, is pointing out a different pole star as we go through that 25,600 year cycle. Our pole star changes. And so we can also date sites not only by, let's say, which constellation they were pointing at, but by which pole star they were using
But they
for
would have
their
just been
northern
pointing
celestial.
north, right? So that's because it's like north is north and the stars shift against the north, right? So how do they know they were pointing to a star,
It's
like
different.
altitude, I guess?
It's it's in a different part of the sky. Yeah,
Well, it's a
it's
different
like a
part of the
different.
sky, but well, I
Yeah.
don't want to take this too far, but it's just when that part of the sky was aligned to north. So, like where you
Yes.
live, unless the tilt angle of Earth changes, and it does slowly, but north is north, and the
Yes.
pole is going to be equal to your latitude. What's your latitude there at Lake Atitlan?
14.9 degrees.
Wow, so close.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that means that the pole star Polaris is 14.9 degrees above the horizon, right? And
Exactly.
5,000 years ago, it would have been like Thuban,
Yes.
but Thuban would have been north and 14 degrees above your horizon, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what determines what star they're pointing to. Maybe some way that they were laying out temples in the shape of a constellation or something. But I want to
It's
return to
yeah.
the E complexes. It's cool to know what those are. Like when I go around the sites and it's like, oh, this site has an A complex and a D or whatever they're called. I've never known what those are. So the E ones are specifically like solar calendar aligned to solstice and equinox events. And
Exactly.
they're all
Yes.
over the place, right? So yeah, I was really
Yes.
interested to hear that you were celebrating solstice with ceremony this morning. I'm wondering, is that part of the Maya tradition? I know, and we'll get back to like the idea of new fire ceremonies and calendar rounds or the beginning of a count or the beginning of a year, which I'm sure is celebrated. But the year doesn't begin with equinox or solstice, but are there ancient celebrations for the equinoxes and solstices as well?
Yeah. I think that the equinoxes and solstices, more the solstices, seem to be the ones which are interesting. Going back to that E group at Washington, what has been kind of like proved is that the equinox sunrise doesn't really line up as well as it should do. And there is a long article that, or a couple of long articles that I've read with regards to, archaeologists going along and measuring the sunrises from different areas and this kind of thing, or at least, now we use computer software and we use, theodolites or whatever to get these markers right. And they're showing that the, kind of like the solstice alignments on these sites is far more accurate than the equinox alignments. The equinox alignments are like, yeah, it's accurate, but you got to stand 1.5 meters over that way
Huh,
to get it. Whereas the solstice
strange.
alignments tend to be more right on, which would seem to suggest that they were far more interested in the solstices as markers within time than they were as the equinoxes. I don't know why. I mean, obviously, they were also very interested in the zenith tubes or the zenith days because we find zenith tubes on sites, whether it's in, like, I think there's one in the Yucatan, I know there's one at Monte Alban, that there are these various sites where they either have a temple with a small tube going through that only the sun can only reach at like zenith,
Hmm.
or it'll be into a like a pit in the ground. Um, it's interesting that like it disappoints me slightly as an
Well,
equinox baby that the equinoxes
solstice.
weren't more like covered in that.
Well,
But
solstice is easier, right? Because
yeah,
basically, when you're watching either at sunrise, or is this a sunrise or sunset site?
sunrise usually, yeah.
Okay, so at sunrise, like at June solstice, or I'm just going to say Cancer solstice, the sun rises furthest north, and at Capricorn solstice, it rises furthest south. And it's just stopping to turn around, which is what solstice means, right? At the tropikos, which is Greek for turnaround, actually, right? But the deal is in between your stop points, you're moving at full speed. Right. So
Yes.
at the equinox, it's just like kind of flying. So on one way, it's easier because you can find the shortest shadow of the day. I mean, assuming there is one, and it's a lot harder to do in the tropics because for months around the zenith passages, you don't get much of a shadow to work with at all, right? But like
Yeah.
here, like I can just measure the shadow of a stick throughout the day, and the short one points north, right? And then I can just draw a square, and I have my east and west. And the assumption is, well, then the equinox sun's going to set due west. But the issue is, I have some like mountains over there, and they're not particularly high, right? So it's not set like I can like mathematically say, okay, somewhere underneath those mountains it's set right there, right? So it's interesting to see like modern times, folks will often like in recreating sites align mathematically. Like we can figure out how far the solstice sunset is, and then there's other cycles like the lunar maximums, which I want to ask you about also. Um, but most of the old sites were aligned in such a way that it's aligned to your actual visual experience, right? So you got to be there and do that. How far is the platform, the observation platform from the buildings? Like, could you scream to somebody over there about, like, hey, move that a little bit to the left?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'd say 40 meters at that.
Okay.
Yeah, 40 to 50 meters, maybe something like that. It's not far. And actually, the very first time that I visited that site, which unfortunately wasn't on either an equinox or a solstice, I had the honor to make ceremony in like the ceremonial fire is between the observation platform and the bank with these little ceremonial like temples on them. They've got a big fire pit there. So that was I mean, it was a pretty special place to be. But kind of like we're also going to Chichen Itza, kind of like the pyramid of Kulkulkan is a relatively modern part of that site. And one of the older parts is El Caracol, the observatory there. And a lot of that observatory was dedicated to rising points and setting points of Venus. Like, kind of watching these funny D-shaped loops that Venus makes. If you observe where Venus is climbing in the sky and where it's dropping down and making all of these kind of different things. And you can see these from this corner of that building to that corner of that building. That's, kind of like let's say the March apparition of, kind of like the morning star phase of Venus. And
Yeah.
from that point over there to that point over there, that's when it's in the evening star phase in June or whatever it might be, and they were very keen on that. Now, there's another woman who wrote a wonderful, highly academic book. I'll say it's highly academic just to give you this tough read, but it's full of amazing information. It's a book called Star Gods of the Maya by Dr. Susan Milbrath. And with regards to the archaeoastronomy, I mean, the references to Anthony Aveni's Skywatchers book are in there as well. But I had the pleasure to see a presentation by Dr. Milbrath a few months ago, where she was talking about censer ceremonies. So you'll find that in different years and for different phases of Venus, you have these censers, incense burners, basically.
Hmm.
And that those four windows at the top of the pyramid of Kukulkan were a recreation of the Karakol temple. And you would have don't ask me exactly why, because I don't really exactly get it. But like, let's say you have the north face, the east face, the south face, and the west face, and each of those represents a different phase of Venus.
Hmm.
And so you might have the east face representing the morning star phase, and then the north face representing the superior conjunction, the west face representing the evening star phase, and then the south face representing the inferior conjunction, which is going to be 8 days. And interestingly enough, when you look at the like the cycle of Venus, the 584-day cycle, you spend about 260 days in the morning star phase and about 260 days in the evening star phase. You
Yeah.
got 8 days down here, and then you got the remaining 50 days in your superior conjunction phase, right? And so those temples were actually used, like, the basically the sensor would be placed in the window which represented whichever phase Venus was in, because it was all to do with, kind of like the Venus Tlaloc cult as well.
And there's
So
the Venus. So there's another thing about the 260 because it's interesting. Like so 260 days between zenith passages at a certain latitude, but then on the other side of that, it's going to be 105 days,
huh?
right? So it's not like the 260 is a cycle in that regard, right? Or like if you think of 260 as human gestation, it's not like a baby is born pregnant, right? You know what I mean?
Okay.
Or if you think of 260 as corn, like you don't plant the day you harvest. Or 260 with the Venus, as you mentioned, like it really depends on the cycle. But if we say, okay, she's kind of like visible 260 as morning star, and then she disappears for 60 to 100 days, depending on the cycle, then we see her 260 on the other side. Still, it's like not a cycle, right? So it's a
Yeah.
260 is such like it's such an intriguing thing to me. I try to relax the need to know. But one
Yeah.
of the pieces that I've loved was in this little wooden book by who is it? Jeff Stray. Do you know him?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's an Englishman. Yes, I
Yeah, he's a
believe
good
so.
mate.
Oh, are you good friends?
Yeah, yeah. Really,
Cool.
really, really nice guy.
That book of
Very down
his,
to
which is
earth.
called the Mayan and Other Ancient Calendars, I believe, one of the little wooden
Yep,
books. I
that's it.
love that book. And then he has that page in there where he shows you things like, I mean, the simple one is that Mars's cycle, or the Mars round, as it's called by some 780 days, is three
Yes.
Sulkins, right? Um,
Yes.
and the Venus at 584, you can multiply by some number and then that's so many Zulkins, right? And then he's
Yes.
showing like all of these different astronomical cycles, like the Jupiter Saturn cycle, and so many of those cycles equals so many 260-day periods. And it seems to be
Yeah.
this kind of like master skeleton key that unlocks all of these different astronomical gears. It's a fantastic thing.
That's it.
There is a bit in his book, though, that I think we can challenge here together. In fact, you already did by telling us when the beginning of the year is. So I'm going to get back there, but I wanted to ask you first. So there is obviously we can see it in some of the sites. There's alignments to solstice and equinox and zenith passage because if you want to, if you're an agricultural society or even if you're nomadic, like you need to follow the year, right? So
Yeah.
this is something I often bring in to folks who are working with lunar phase calendars, for example, right? Which is itself a tricky thing because if you do alternating months between 29 and 30 to keep the 29 and a half day pace from new moon to new moon, the issue is 12 months equals 354 days, and that's not a year, right? So,
Yeah.
in most of these calendars, like the Chinese calendar, the Hebrew calendar, which was the Akkadian, the Babylonian, like there's a really beautiful and intricate system of adding leap months. Like Julie had written earlier, how in New Zealand, and this is true in Hawaii as well. In Hawaii, they call it Makahiki, the New Year, and it's around the time of the acronychal rise of the Pleiades. So when at
Yeah.
sunset the Pleiades are seen rising, which in it of itself, like that sounds great on paper, but when you go try to do that, you don't see much at sunset. And so the whole thing kind of feels arbitrary. And a lot of modern people celebrate this November 17th because it's kind of like the mathematical sun opposite the Pleiades. But the issue is those cultures are using a lunar calendar anyway.
Yeah.
So it's like you have that star experience to let you know where you are in the solar year. But then your next month is going to start with the sliver moon anyway, right? Um,
Yeah.
so there's so many ways for us to get back in line with sacred time. It's weird for those of us who call this thing like December 21st, for example, and these months of 31 and 30, 31, 31, 31, 30. That thing that's 28, but sometimes 29, and it just feels pretty far out. I will say the average time it takes for a sun to move through a 12th part of the ecliptic is 30.44 days. That's just the year divided by 12. So obviously switching between 30 and 31 kind of keeps that. It just doesn't do it so well. But regardless what kind of calendar we want to keep, like I always encourage folks to realign themselves to the moon, right? But if you do, then you need to do some synchronization to get your polyrhythms together if you like things like food and survival and whatnot. So we certainly do see a solar calendar in the Mayan times. And I keep saying that, but I want to end there. I'm wondering, Mark, do you practice with the moon, or do the elders that you're connected with, do they work with moon cycles also?
Not so much. No, no. I mean, really, I think everything is far more based around the sacred calendar and the movement of the 260 days and working with that than it is with anything else. That, I mean, you've got your cycles of 13 days, two cycles going to be 26 days. We're never going to come into that kind of like that lunar cycle. It just doesn't add up in the right way.
And there aren't like
And
full moon ceremonies just because it's full moon out. It's more tuned to keeping the sacred count of days, and that's the principal structure.
exactly,
Yeah.
I've not observed full moon ceremonies. I've observed New Year ceremonies, which I say, like for us, is February 19th right now. And the Mayan solar calendar is a calendar of 365 days. So every 4 years, that's going to move back one day. And there was this,
Oh, so it's February 19th right now, but it's going to be February 18th, and then it will be February 17th. And 1,000 years
exactly. So,
ago, it was in June or what, that's just not good math. I'm just like making an example. Yeah, okay,
yeah,
so
it's,
that's where I want to be.
yeah,
So
so
to
for
celebrate solstice and
1000,
equinox, that's kind of a personal thing, but we obviously see it was worked by sites. And because this is a way, and same with the Zenith passages, to keep the year, which is really necessary if you're going to be nomadic, be agricultural, especially whatnot, right? And we
yeah,
do know in the Maya, there was a 365-day calendar called the Hab. Yeah.
yes,
And it's interesting that one too, right? Because these months, like, there's a 13-day period. That's what's a trecena,
yes,
right? And that's just because you're going from one day sign to two of the next day sign, three, and you make it all the way through the 13. Mark, by the way, friends who are here, check him out. So fourpillars.net.
.net, yeah,
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 fourpillars.net. Mark does a video every 13 days for the trecena ahead, and they are wonderful. And if you want to start tuning into some of the language of these energies of these different day signs, it's a really wonderful place to be. It's such a wonderful offering that you give, Mark, and that you do
thank you.
so consistently. And how long have you been doing that for?
I've written, I write about the energy of the day and I publish at 5 p.m. Guatemala time for the next day. I've been doing that since Wanakabal in 2015. So that was like November 15th of 2015 was my first blog post every day since I've been
Wow.
publishing. And sometime in February of 2018 was when I started the Tresena videos, which I publish every 13 days. And to be honest, sometimes you make a rod for your own back, because if something happens and you can't make a video, people like, you get these emails, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" Which is really sweet, but people kind of like get used to it coming out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're 3 days into the Trecena now. If you go to my site and look back kind of like 2 or 3 days, you'll find a video called the Trecena of Tea, which will guide you through the 13 days, which will take us up to 31st of December. And then 1st of January actually lines up that it's a new Trecena beginning on the 1st of January, which is kind of interesting, unusual. But one of the things I just wanted to mention, that harb calendar that we were talking about. So in 2020, 2024 is the leap year. Yeah. So 2025 is the year when the renewal of the Mayan solar year, as observed here in the highlands of Guatemala, will move back to the 18th of February.
Oh, got you. So
And
it dances back kind of a day four times or three times and then pops back to
no,
where it was.
it goes back a day every 4 years, and it goes back and it goes back and it goes back. And it's interesting. Some people who may have been involved in, kind of like Mayan calendars, or think they were involved in Mayan calendars, may have come across the dream spell, which has this so-called day out of time on July 25th or 26th or something like that. The whole reason for that was Diego de Landa, the guy who burnt all the Mayan books. Well, before he burnt those books, he spent a long time studying the Maya, and he wrote a book about them, which is what Jose Arguelles kind of like used as source material, like as part from Tony Shearer and partly from that book. And he observed this new year on, like say, 26th of July or something like that. And to this day, you get a lot of people that tell you that Mayan New Year is 26th of July. But, kind of like it was back in something like 1480, 1580 or something like that. Since then, of course, it's moved back. So kind of like, what you actually find Maya people celebrating is right now, 19th of February. But if we extrapolate that back, there was actually a very, very, very interesting article by a woman called Geraldine Patrick Encina. And she put forward this idea that the days would actually be started, or that the years would actually be started at different times of the day. And this would be based on the bearer of the year. So the Mayan solar calendar has 4 bearers of the year. There are 4 Nahuales of the sacred calendar on which the Mayan solar year can start.
Yeah,
Now,
can I interrupt you there and just say a little bit more
yeah,
about that? Because it's like so hard to see this until you start playing with the wheels of time within the wheels of time within the wheels of time. But
sure.
there's what many now refer to as a 52-year calendar round. And this is, so we're looking at a 260-day count. So I think everyone's got that, right? There's 13 and there's 20. And the 13 and the 20 mesh to make 260. So like I was born on 3 Kesh or 3 Deer, and that comes around every 260 days, right? Um, then you also have a date in the hub, right? You have a date in the long count, you have a date in the Gregorian, you have a date in the sun and the tropical zodiac, right? There's all these different ways that we can keep time, but the hub of 365 days and the Zolkin of 260 days, right, are very strange polyrhythms if you want to synchronize that, right? So like to go back to that example of triplicity and quadruplicity, if you have a set of 3 and a set of 4, that synchronizes every 12. If you have 13 and 20, that synchronizes every 260. If you have 260 and 365, good luck, right? But what ends up happening
Mm.
is that there is a grand cycle over 52 years, or maybe 52 years minus 13 days, and we'll get back to that because this is part of this perhaps new revelation, which for me just rings so true and speaks of such a more beautiful, organic way of doing leap day or leap year. So, yeah, let me speak to that actually for a bit. So, I think everyone's familiar with the Gregorian reform. Like we in our tropical zodiac are about 10 degrees off, like where the sun is in a zodiac sign from the Gregorian calendar date, right? So it's currently the 21st, so I can just add 10 to that and I get to 31, which means the first degree of the next sign because every sign has 30 degrees. So somebody born on what's your birthday, Mark?
22nd of September.
Right, so then I would just add 10 and I'm at 32, and so I'd say 2 degrees of Libra. Um, and you're going to get within a few. Sometimes you don't get around the cusp, but it's this weird thing that we're like 10 days off. Again, wouldn't it be nice if we had 30 days and the sun moves into the sign on the first day of the month, and but then you have a 360-day year, and that's not how long a year is, right? So it has some issues. But I had wondered because what happened in the 16th century, although not everywhere, because a lot of people delayed this and resisted, but this was the Gregorian calendar. Um, Whatever it's called, reform, right? Because they had been working this Julian calendar, which considered the year to be 365 and a quarter days long. And the way you deal with that is the way that we're most familiar with how we're working our calendar, right? You have 365-day years for 3 years, and every fourth year you have a leap day, making a 366-day year. And those 4 years therefore cover that extra quarter of a day in an orbit of the sun, right? So it's a challenging thing that the Earth is orbiting the sun. It'd be nice if it did it in 360 days. The math would be a lot easier, but it's 365, and even worse, it's 365 and change. And if it was 365.25, and the good news is you can do this leap day thing of just adding an extra day every fourth year, and that February thing goes from 28 to 29, and you're all good. The issue is the year is 365.242199 dot dot dot, and it's not even as simple. And so what happened at the Gregorian reform, first of all, they had noticed that Easter was slipping from equinox. And the cool thing for astrology at this time was like, because the church couldn't figure out what went wrong, like there were cats talking about, oh, I think Adam recorded Monday wrong the first time, or, like people, so there were some hilarious things were said, but they had to go dust off the astrology texts, right? And the texts from other religions and whatnot, because people had figured this out long ago. And then they also built these amazing, like, astrology calendars. Like a place I always bring all my students, at least by video, is to the Vatican, because there's this like stolen obelisk from Egypt there with a nifty cross on top, and they use it as a sundial for the day, but they're also using it as a meridian calendar for the year. And at St. Peter's Square, you can trace the shadow length of this Egyptian obelisk against this bronze path where they have the tropical zodiac signs laid out to know where you are in the year, which I think is a brilliant thing. And you see this in a lot of churches, actually, that they were kind of trying to realign to time and figure it out. And the issue was that we just had the year wrong in the Julian count. So when they did sort this out, and the Gregorian reform came, like what we do now is we have a leap year every fourth year, right? If the year is divisible by 4. So that's why 2024 is a leap year. But it's not a leap year if the year is divisible by 100. So 2100, which is divisible by 4, will not be a leap year because it's divisible by 100. Unless it's also divisible by 400. So 2000 was a leap year, right? Because it's divisible by 4, leap year. It's divisible by 100, not leap year. It's divisible by 400, yes, a leap year. And then that gets your year to 365.2422, which is super close. And so where we're at right now with this Gregorian calendar is every few thousand years, they have to do a little bit of extra calendar kung fu to kind of keep pace with the equinoxes and solstices. And it's a weird system, but it works. But what happened in I want to say 1562, but I think it was after that. Like they just moved from October 4th one day to October 14th the next day. right? So they just like took 10 days out so that like now the calendar would fall back and equinox would be closer to Easter's, but is closer to equinox as it's meant to be, right? Because the Julian math was wrong, and after so many centuries, things had like processed through the year, so they had to just subtract 10 days. So because our current zodiac math is like 10 days off from moving into a new sign on the first of a month, I was wondering if that's how it used to be, but the answer is no. It actually fell in the other direction to get to the point where you had to like add 20 instead of 10. So everyone, I think, has kind of explored the weirdness of the Gregorian calendar. I mean, some claim that it's purposefully disharmonic to keep us off natural time and being natural human beings. And I'm willing to entertain any conspiracy theory personally, and I'm okay with that. And I think it can have that effect. But there is also something, and it's definitely a solar calendar of a solar culture. And while I would put the 30s and the 31s in different places, and I feel like the February 28 is actually just like a throwback to the old moon calendars or something. I really don't know. When you go back to the Roman calendar and the Greek calendars before that in like in Athens and Alexandria, and then like the Egyptian, there were like more like 36 divisions of these 10-day periods that are the faces or the decans. And like back in Egyptian time, there's kind of like quote unquote 36 hours in a day, and then quote unquote 36 weeks in a year, right? It's hard to call these things months if it's not aligned to a month, or a week if it's not 7 days, right? Like it just gets confusing. And I'm really excited. I'm going to teach a class next year where I just kind of lay all these things out with a lot of slides and help people integrate the challenge of time, right? But so for the Maya, there's this incredible system where you've got now 52 years that it takes for the 260-day count and the 365-day count themselves to coincide. And what Mark was saying before, these four signs that are called year bearers work in such a way that the beginning of the hub, their 365-day count, is always going to land on one of four nawals or day signs. And they'll move actually through like this. What's this year, Mark?
Tenker.
It's what?
Tenker.
Oh, really? I'm looking at this thing says 11, so they must be off. Or maybe they're
It
using
says 11 kech on there because they're following the harb, and they're following what we call the archaeological count. But what the actual Maya elders here are celebrating is 10 kech. Okay. Now the difference is the starting point, because the starting point of the harb, as I said, is like 31st of March, and the Mayan New Year celebrated in the highlands of Guatemala is 40 days earlier, on the 19th of February. 40 days exactly. Now, that, because of the way that the calendar works, means it happens on the same year Lord as in Kech, but it is one number before because of the way the numbering goes. So that is right, what you've got there from a certain point of view.
for a different calendar
Mm-hmm.
culture at this point.
Yeah.
And yeah, so let's deal with this weirdness of four different year bearers at different times. Like Landa's four were different. And I didn't
Yeah.
know that. So you're working with the same four as whatever this app is, probably like Yucatec. Um, but since it's 40 days off, that's just two trips through 20. So you have the same
Yes.
day sign, but wouldn't it be off by two numbers then?
No, because when
Oh,
you look at the calendar, it will go 1, 8, 2, 9, 3,
right.
10, 4, 11, and so on and so on and so on. So
Right.
you
Because
get this
it's
kind of like piano
13.
type structure, I
Yeah.
call it, where
Because
you've
for
got,
I just like I just figured it out. 40 days is 13, 26, 39, right? Three times through 13 and then
yeah,
one. Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
it's so crazy. Like, I mean, this must be just so natural for you now. You've been keeping time in this way for so long, but to like try to be in 13 and 20 consciousness. And we should also mention that the Hob is 19, some call them months, but it's 18 periods of 20 days, correct? And then
Yes,
an extra period of 5 days.
exactly. And interestingly enough, we were talking about the long count earlier on, which their year or the year of the long count called the Tun is a 360-day year. And it was the long count that turned over in 2012. And when we celebrated the turning of the Tun, it was now back in about 5th or 6th of November, because over 10 cycles of the Tun, it's processed 50 days backwards. Okay. So one of the things I find interesting is that when you look at these calendars, often those 5 days are not well thought of, whether it's the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Maya. They're called days of sorrow. Some people put forward the idea that these people were so into their perfect mathematics that these 5 days that messed stuff up were seen as these annoying days that nobody wanted. And some days literally call them days of mourning, days of sorrow. It's almost as if the 360-day year existed and then something happened to give us 5 extra days.
Yeah, well,
That,
I think there's a story that tells us maybe what did happen. I'll say there's one, to what I'm aware of, one Hellenistic astrology technique. So from a couple thousand years ago, in kind of Greek Egypt, that uses so-called Egyptian years of 360 days. Right. And there's this wonderful story from long ago that these twins, Jeb and Newt, who were like Father Earth and Mother Sky, right, could not be together, and that they were forced to be apart for all 360 days of the year, right? And then Jehuti, who many will know as Thoth or Tot or Tot, um, like battled Khonsu, a god of the moon, at the ancient game of Senate, and for his winnings and he won, he demanded that like the moon increase her light to bring us 5 more days. And in those 5 days, then Jeb and Newt could celebrate their love. And that's where their children, who, at least in the Greek, are Osiris and Isis and Seth and Nephthys, came from. Um, but I wonder, because the story of the moon increasing its light, if somehow we did once have a 360-day orbit, but the moon was somehow pushed closer to us. And if the moon was closer to us, and I'm not exactly sure, but it feels in my physics mind that that means Earth would spin faster. So if we're spinning slightly faster, we're going to have more days in an orbit. And I've wondered if there is actually some kind of cataclysmic astronomy built into that story, which I think 5 days of celebrating love and bringing babies is wonderful, but also if there was some kind of lunar cataclysm there, right, those would be seen as 5 tricky days. So these are not like 5 days where you party in Maya time, huh? So right now the Hob is kind of cycling in mid-February, as you mentioned before.
yeah.
And so the last 5 days, what kind of practices do you have in those 5 days?
Well, in those days, like in general, so most people know it as Wayeb. Okay, these 5 days. And they are the days when time is out of alignment, let's say. I could get very technical with regards to year lords and all that kind of thing. But if we said that if we looked at each year lord as an entity that takes charge of being the captain of the ship that we call the year 10 Kech, right? The year comes around, 10 Kech takes charge. He's the captain for the year. Well, after 260 days, he's gone through one cycle that usually lands around about 6th of November. And he's kind of like getting a bit done. And then he's got this extra 100 days where he's kind of going into the underworld. And for the last 5 days of the cycle, I think that the Year Lord is dead, and the ship is only being steered by the ghost of the previous Year Lord. Now, if you imagine that you are on a ship where the captain is a ghost, what would you do? You'd drop anchor, right? You'd just sit it out for 5 days. You wouldn't make any sudden moves or anything like that. Don't try and navigate. Don't try and go anywhere. Drop your anchor and sit tight for 5 days until the new captain arrives. And so, in the tradition with which I was trained, those 5 days are days when you don't light fires, you don't make public ceremonies, you don't kind of like you clean your house and you pray and you meditate and you fast and you do those kind of things before welcoming in the new mam on, as we would, as we would say, or as we would say in the Gregorian calendar, 19th of February, basically from 14th to the 18th, fasting, praying, quiet time. And I've done like I've done several years where I just really keep myself to myself. Of course, sometimes I have to go out and get some food somewhere or something like that, but other than that, I don't do a lot. Last year I was actually traveling last year during Wayeb because we had a film crew come here that I was guiding around some temples in Peten, and they had to do it then, and I was like, okay, but we do, but like, okay, all right, and it all went fine, but like, yeah, so that's the way that is normally practiced.
So it's the
Here,
first day of the year. What is the first month of the Hob?
the first month of the harb is the pop.
Pop. So it'll
Zero
be
pop is
one
the
pop.
first day.
Oh, zero pop.
Yes, it
Oh, cool.
begins
So
on
it
day
goes
zero
zero
and
to
runs to day
19.
19. Yeah,
Wow. Yeah, and so that's interesting because they don't use the zero in the Tzolk'in. I'm sorry, I keep speaking the Yucatec word the same way.
yeah,
Like
no,
I
no,
remember
that's
using.
done differently. But yeah, you'd see kind of like the um in the cycle of the long count and in the cycle of the hub, they use zeros and 0 to 19. And even kind of like when we look at things, one of the things that we'll see, like that whole creation, I'll say it right now, creation day, 4 3 Kankin, 21st December 2012 was a creation day, not a destruction day. The destruction would have happened on 13 Kawok the day before, because that's when Kawok comes to flush away the old world before 4 Arpu grounds the holy Arpu into the material, the four.
Hmm.
Okay, so kind of like, yeah, I think everybody is getting there a day late. But it's interesting when we look at that calendar, that solar calendar. The year lords, you were saying about me using the same year lords. I have a wonderful little book up here which shows three calendars from 1685, 1722, and 1835, which show the same year lords. They have not changed over time. And this is, what I love about this book is that this is recording by the Franciscan friars, I think it was, or whoever. And they're recording it from the people of San Pedro La Laguna, from Santa Catarina Ixtahuacan, and from somewhere else. I think it's Quetzaltenango or somewhere like that. But it was before, kind of like, let's say, the new agey stuff had come out and polluted anything. Before there was that influence. This is just like they wrote that down and they recorded it and left it here in the libraries or whatever. And these three scientists came and dug it up and translated it and to what it shows and how it's translated. Now, the interesting thing is that the month names are, of course, different here. So instead of our first month being called Pop, it's called Nabe Mam. Nabe Mam means the first season of the old age.
Hmm.
And the prophecy, or it's not really prophecy, like, let's say, the note which goes along with that is that corn planted in this time will not come to full fruition. The reason why I find that interesting is because that dropping back one day every 4 years of the beginning of that calendar was something that Geraldine, Patrick, and Sina was addressing, and we came independently to the same idea, which is that New Year's Day should be around about 13th of August.
And so, yeah, this brings us to this just like much more organic way to practice with the fraction of the year, which is such a complication for any solar calendar, whether you want to have 13-day periods or 30-day periods or whatever, is you've got this 365.242199, right? Um, and it's not like the Maya were not incredibly advanced mathematically or that others have, but dealing with a fraction to that extent is a mess. I explained earlier how like the Gregorian calendar is doing it, which is pretty cool to kind of like add and take away. But what if we just changed where we started the day every year? So even before I go there, I grew up in a culture that for some reason begins the day at midnight, right? And it's not even real midnight, it's this 12 on a clock thing, which isn't necessarily the exact moment of the sun rooting down below the ground before it will come up again. It seems to make a lot more sense just in my own kind of harmonic structure of day begins when the sun rises and the birds are chirping in that. I will say there are many, many, many cultures who begin days at sunset. And that seems really strange until you start keeping a moon calendar. Because for most moon calendar cultures, you begin the month not at the new moon of the moon sun conjunction, because that's a no moon, you can't see it, but rather when the moon is first seen as the sliver waxing crescent, typically the next day, sometimes two. And that begins your month because it's the rebirth of the moon. And that happens in the sunset sky. In other words, it's just the beginning of nighttime. And if that's the first day of your month, then the next day is going to be a day later, which is the next sunset, right? So there's a lot of cultures who have kept calendars that begin their days at sunset, which is a trippy thing. Like Galileo's chart we have, and he's written out the day of his birth, and at the top it says February 15th, and then it says February 16th. Like he doesn't even know what day he's born, but no, he's actually just showing you two different ways of expressing time. One in the old way in Pisa, where he was born, which was still in fashion, which is measuring hours from the previous day's sunset. And then the February 16th is the new convention with the whole AM PM situation, right? Um, I haven't yet found a culture that begins days at midday, which is, again, it's an easy thing to see because if you put a stick in the ground, it's the shortest shadow of the day. And if you draw a line on that shortest shadow of the day, then the next day is a lot easier. It's just when the shadow hits the line. That's midday, right? So it's like it's an easy thing to do technically. Where do you celebrate the beginning of the day, Mark? Are you a middle of the night when the sun begins its climb, or sun rising in the east or setting in the west?
It's a very hot topic within uh, the Mayan calendar world. We have all three cultures here in Guatemala. Many people who come to the lake will study over in San Pedro, and there they will certainly tell you that if you are born before sunrise, you're carrying the energy of the day before. And that all sounds good. Heard it from a Mayan elder. So, but if you go up to Coban and you speak to the people there, they say that the day begins at sunset. So if you're born between sunset and midnight, you have the energy of the next day. Who's right? Well, they're all respected. They're all elders to be listened to, and they both have a point of view. And so I asked my teacher what I should take, and he said take midnight. And for me, energetically, looking at the energy of the days and the way that it ebbs and flows, what we would see is that, like, my teacher says the energy of the next day starts knocking on the door. at sunset of the day before. Now, you may have like experienced and felt this yourself as, you're having a day and the feeling of the day completely changes when the sun goes down. Sometimes it's like you're having a really good day and kind of things go a bit wonky when the sun goes down. You think, what happened? And all that kind of thing. Maybe the new energy's coming. And likewise, I see the energy of the previous day hanging around until sunrise of the next day. I think that all of those elders have got a very, very good point to make. And if that we are born in the night, then we are carrying a bit of the energy of the day before or a bit of the energy of the next day. It's not as simple and straightforward as saying you're this and you're only this, unless you're born at midday, which is the high point, the highest energy of the sun, which is carrying that Nawal. So for me, like beginning the days at midnight. So if I was doing your chart and you were born at like 3 a.m., well, I say, well, that's, on your birthday, then you're definitely a 3 Kech. If you were born at 10 minutes past midnight, you're a 3 Kech with a lot of 2 Kame in there. And consequently, if you were, or consequently, whatever, like if you were born at 11 p.m. of that day, and it's like, yeah, okay, you're 4 Kech. But you know what? You're 3 Kech, but you know what? You got some 4 Hanil coming on in there as well. And so if we were to look at it as who would I see as prime 3 Kech, that would be the person that was born at midday.
And do you
And
work with the
somebody,
time where the person was born? Because I've seen some will kind of convert it to what time it was in Guatemala.
yeah, no, I don't. What I've found is that what can be interesting to do is move the date line from, or move the prime meridian from Greenwich to Guatemala,
Hmm.
and that moves the date line. But interestingly enough, it makes Australians that were born in the beginning of the day actually born at the end of the day. It
Uh-huh.
doesn't shift the day on which they were born. It just changes kind of like from like, let's say, morning to evening.
I want to mention
And
just while you're here, I said your website incorrectly before. So Mark's not at fourpillars.net. It's
the4pillars.net.
the4pillars.net. So THE four pillars. Four pillars.net actually brings you to a feng shui site, which is interesting because I want to bring us into the directions now, which is part of that tradition as well. So yeah, I it's going to be hard. Like everyone, go do your research, go to Mark's site, go look around, look into this idea of the 52-year calendar round and the year bearers, and you'll start to see more clearly how that works. But basically, again, every 365 days, a new hub begins. As Mark was saying, that's happening in February these days. And it's only going to land on one of the 4 day signs in the Zolkin. And it will actually move through those 4 day signs. So right now it's 10 money or 10 kesh, 10 deer.
10 yeah.
So next year is going to be 11, which,
Eh.
and then 12, what's the
Then
next year?
12 Noch,
And
and
then
then 13
13.
Ik
And then we
in
get to
2025.
one, then we get to one cash.
Kech,
Right.
yes,
Cash.
exactly.
I can't do that.
Yeah.
All right, so you'll
Now,
have one of, I'm just going to call them A, B, C, D right now. You have like 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D, 5A, 6B, 7C, 8D. Even this is hard. 9A, 10B, uh, 11C, 12D, 13A, and then 1B, right? So I don't know if that's landing
yes,
for anyone, but that's like it
yes,
moves in this very intricate system, and only going to have 1A and 1A every 52 years, which some call the calendar round because it's that amount of time, this great amount of time that synchronizes these rhythms, these polyrhythms of 260 days and 365 days. Now, since it's 365 days and not 365.2422, right? You're slipping backwards through the calendar as you're moving. But and this is where this new theory comes in and why it seems to make so much sense. What if one year we had a year that started at sunrise? And you have 365 days from sunrise to sunset. And you might imagine that kind of year as like a new beginnings year because sunrise is such a clear energy of new beginnings, right? So you 365 of those and a quarter. And you don't have to care if it's 0.25 or 0.2421967, whatever, It's like, here's the beginning of this day, and the next year will start here at midday, right? Because you've just done 365 and a quarter. And then you do a whole year where you're working midday to midday. And I would imagine if this was true, then those years would be amazing and awesome and super light and day-like, right? And then to go 365 of those and then add a quarter, now you're starting your next year at sunset. And every day of that year begins at sunset, right? And then the next year it's a middle of the night year, and the next year you're back to a sunrise year. And whether this was happening in practice or not, and Mark can say a lot more about that than I can, as Mark was saying before, he feels that actually maybe the Hob should be beginning in August and not precessing at all. And it wouldn't precess, it wouldn't move backwards through the calendar at all if you were doing this kind of organic way of adding that quarter of a day. And we might see some indications of this in that these 4 year bearers are associated with the 4 directions.
Mhm.
But then this is why I was just so stoked to talk to you. And I was like, as long as we're talking, let's just like bring people here live and record it so the dog can bark about it. But like the one question I had for you is for me, when I practice with the directions in like a Northern Hemispherian fashion, and I'll see this in like Lakota tradition in Inipi and Sweat Lodge or whatever, where you come in sunwise, which is clockwise, right? In the Northern Hemisphere sky, the clock was designed on how the sun rises in the east and reaches in the south and sets in the west, and at least we believe will root down below the ground in the north, something we can never see, right? And so I often, when I'm kind of aligned to the directions, I'll work with the buried ones and then what's rising and what's reaching and then coming down to rest and like that. And I'm always moving like a clock. But that's not how Maya ceremonies practice, right, Mark? How do you call in the directions, or in which order?
When I call in the directions, I call them in east, west, south, north. And they are called in with the what are known as the 4 first grandparents. And so you're calling in the energies of Balam Kitse and Kahapaluna from the east, Balamakab and Chomicha from the west, Mahukutach and Sununiya from the south, and Balamikim and Kakishacha from the north. But going back to the directions that you were talking about, there's a very, very interesting thing that you find when you start looking at Mayan epigraphy, which is that east and west and north and south are termed in slightly different ways. East is seen as entrance of the sun. West is seen as exit of the sun. We understand that. Comes in, it goes out over there.
Right.
But north and south are, I don't know whether I got this the right way around, but they're Nohol and Shaman. And those 2 words also double to represent Zenith and Nadir. Okay, and so you're not only got the horizontal cross of the 4 directions, you've also got sunrise, midday, sunset, midnight. And so when you start looking at it like that, exactly what you were saying with regards to when you're starting the day, how you're working with it, we can understand that there would be a direction, and that direction would be attached to a particular Nawal. So, for example, Noch is considered to be in the east, Ik is considered to be in the north, Kech is considered to be in the west, and Ech is considered to be in the south. And what Geraldine was postulating was that Noch years would begin at sunrise. Kech years would begin at midday. Sorry, ik years would begin at midday. Kech years would begin at sunset, and ech years would begin at midnight. So she actually already put it together.
So Kech
The
is a west sign. It's
Yes,
associated with the west.
yes,
And so
yeah.
this year, I mean, what do you say in general about any Kech year, whether it's one, two, three, four, five through 13? Is there a general kind of transmission of what it is to begin the Hab with a Kech day?
The Kekias are said to be strong and dominant, and sometimes they can lead to wild behavior because Kek can be like it can the that deer. We're not talking about kind of like Bambi. We're talking about, well, grown up Bambi, the Lord of the Forest. We're talking about the wild horse, and that horse, if it is not if we try and contain it, it's going to kick and butt and bite. And so it's about kind of like making sure that we got our sovereignty and all that kind of thing. And it can, it might stampede as well. So Kek years tend to be, they can be kind of turbulent. Ik years can also be turbulent.
Do you
Um,
feel that in the West, though, or in maybe some of the other Nawals that aren't year bearers that are also associated with the direction west? Is there a wildness that they
no,
share
they
or
bring in
anything
different
else?
qualities. They're totally different. Kek is in like in a law to itself. And we get two so-called gentle years of and Noch, and two chaotic years of Ik and Kech. Now, what you'll also find, you kind of touched on it, but you didn't quite go there, was that the 52-year period is made up of four tresenas of years. We started with one Ik in 2013. We're going to finish with 13 Ik in 2025. And so we can see that we have 13-year bundles. We can also see that that's a repeating 52-year pattern. So if we look back, we're talking 2013 to 2025, but we're also talking 1961 to 1973. And so looking at resonances which are coming through that cycle of time. Now, I want to show you this. It's sort of like, if you'll forgive me or permit me just for a moment, that Venus table in the Dresden Codex, we've got 5 pages of Venus table. Okay. And that is showing Venus's, oh, hang on. Sorry. I'm trying to get it in the right way. That is showing Venus's movements over each. To go across the top takes 8 years. To go through the whole table, how long? 13 times 8. Well, it works out as 104 years less 26 days to do that whole table, which is twice that 52 years less 13 days.
Oh, it's interesting the 26 as well. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people who are watching this on my channel are really familiar with the Venus star, as we call it. Venus will align retrograde with the sun in the same sign every 8 years, right? So there's five
Yeah.
different signs where Venus is kind of drawing this star, both interior conjunctions, Venus between us and the sun, which is retrograde Venus, and then 4 years later, she'll go behind the sun in that same sign, like in that same degree of the zodiac. But it's actually 8 years minus 2 days that the whole, and it's not exactly two either. So um,
And
that
that's eight harb. It's
eight
eight
Hob,
365-day
right?
years.
If there is no organic leap year attempt, and if it does precess through the zodiac, right? But what I'm
Yeah.
interested, because I've heard that number 104. An interesting thing, Mark, is that on average, one of what we call the Venus star points will stay in the same sign of the zodiac for like 104 years because it's moving backwards retrograde through the signs, right? And that, I
Yeah.
mean, it's almost like a, dare I say, coincidence. It's not. But so the 104 are two 52-year calendar rounds, and the 104 minus 26 days makes it feel like the Hob actually is meant to be precessing if it's also configured to these appearances of Venus, where we see El Caracol and other buildings aligned to these Venus statements over time.
The interesting thing is that if you look in things like the Dresden Codex, what you'll find is that the correction factors, because they knew that things were out because they were measuring them and recycling tables and that kind of thing, and they put correction factors. So when you look down, I mean, I wouldn't want to give the impression that I can read this correctly. I can understand parts of it, but this sort of gubbins down the bottom here. Part of this is about correcting factors. And when you look into what they did with regards to the solar year, their solar year calculation was actually more accurate than Ptolemy's, what they were working with. And so they were ahead of us for quite a long time. In fact, by the time that we got ahead of them, their civilization had collapsed. So, you know, they were doing pretty well.
I'm just looking at Venus in 2027. So I'll turn 52 in 2027. I was born in 75 on October 24th. And I was just looking at, okay, well, it's not 52. It's not on my solar return, which that year is actually on October 24th. Everyone who's practicing with astrology understands that sometimes your solar return, when the sun gets back to the same degree of the zodiac, will be the day before or after your calendar birth because of this whole leap year issue, right? So that year I do have my solar return on October 24th, but that's not a three, I'm going to say deer, a
No,
three deer day as it was when I was born. It was 13 days before my 52nd birthday. And that's because
exactly.
of the same kind of precessional quality. So, a thing that I'm excited to go tune into is looking at the Venus structure. 52, obviously, it's a fun number otherwise, right? 52 cards in the card deck where we do get the 13s in there, right? That's like, many say it's a solar calendar where you have 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, right? So there's this weird way where like European cards are trying to align to Maya time somehow. But yeah, I guess I have this question of, will my calendar round be with my 52nd solar return on October 24th that year, or will it be 13 days earlier on October 11th? And one thing that I love about this conversation is because of what you just showed me with the Venus tables. Um, I'm like really sold on this idea of doing this organic leap year and doing a year of sunrise years and a year of midday years and that. Like, I'm going to be teaching again this like aligning with natural time class. So it's going to speak more about just astronomical time and how do we actually know, how long the day is, what can we work with, how can we put sticks in the ground, measure the shadow, things like that. Um, and I'm really keen on this idea, which I think you first introduced me to, about this idea of like an organic leap day and moving from a sunrise year to a midday year, and that, which I think would just be a wonderful way for us to be practicing energetically as well. And really returns us to, the four pillars, to mention your website, the fourpillars.net again. There's those four pillars of the directions, of the seasons, of the rise and the reach and the rest and the root, like that four, which, is coming into matter. And probably would have been, I don't know, a little easier to receive all of this information on a 4 day, because 3 days are kind of mutable, right? As it's been in our conversation today. And I'm born on one of those 3 days too. Um, but yeah, I love this image of, should this thing precess and move through the whole year? And then what happens when it gets back again? Which it said that, the Egyptians kept a lunar calendar, kept a solar calendar, kept a star calendar, like mostly aligned with Sirius, with solstice. And it was tracked, and they were around long enough to like watch that thing go all the way backwards through the seasons and get back to where it was beginning or something. And certainly we can see in looking at these great Mayan calendars and or Olmec, or some would say Mesoamerican, which I don't know that that's the right word, but these calendars that were kept by so many. Even there's evidence of up here, north of Mexico, of some keeping the 260-day count, it would seem, and keeping it like later in time. And obviously, it's being kept now. But, there is no doubt that these cats were so deep in the like intricate structure of time, right? And were able to look so far ahead accurately and that far back. And then there's this question of why. Anyway, Mark, speaking of time, I think I better go get some of that solstice light on my face. I'm so happy that you came and also allowed me to record this thing and share it with some people here live. I'm not seeing any questions in the box right now. There's been a lot of fun things happening in the chat. So I imagine everyone has your mind equally blown as mine is. Every time I sit with you, I get to learn so much, and I really appreciate you also letting me interject and add a few pieces, the key structures. I really hope people who have not yet will go look at these different calendars, these different Mayan calendars, as we often call them, and see how they interconnect and tune into that type of time. And I cannot highly enough recommend that you reach out to Mark and receive some word about the year in which you were born and the Trecena and the day. And there's much more. He has a really wonderful way of sharing this information and helping you align to you. Mark, do you have any last things you want to say before we fly off into space?
I think just kind of like, I think everybody should go look at the sky in whatever form of timekeeping that they choose and whatever form of astrology that they choose. You got to know where things are. Work out the shadow play in your yard. Work out the shadows from the longest day, the shorter day, the quarter days, all of this kind of thing, and plan your magic around it.
Mm.
This, for me, is what unlocks it. This is my constant battle. Sorry if I just want to sorry if I go on a bit here.
Please do.
You were saying earlier about people going to Stonehenge. I mean, I had a lot of posts from my friends at Stonehenge today, also at Newgrange in Ireland. Uh, Wonderful, amazing site. I mean, you have to be a lottery winner to get into there at midwinter. But what also gets me is the quarter days and Samhain. Kind of like we've got a whole bunch of people all kind of like practicing their or making their practice on 31st of October or 1st of November, when actually astronomical Samhain is more somewhere around about the 6th of November. And if we want to align with the true energies, we have to go and look at the sky. We have to go and see what things are doing, because if we want to do something, we might as well get the timing right on it. And so I think it's a wonderful thing when we have this ability to engage with our practice. We have this ability to engage with our true potential, and getting the timing right is an essential part of that. And we do that by watching the sky.
So remember to look up, folks. I had a really fun one this morning. So there's a hill over here I call Solstice Hill because it's where this December solstice or winter solstice sun for me sets. There's like a tree I call the birthing tree, right? Because now the sun will be reborn and our days will start growing a little bit longer, very slowly away from this longest night and all. But what was amazing this morning is the first light from the rising sun. We don't have much of a eastern thing happening. There's houses and a hill, and so I wanted to go see the sunrise, and it was like behind someone's house. But when I came over here and looked to the southwest, the first light on the land was also striking Solstice Hill over there. So that was like a new one for me. I just love the way that you described that too, Mark. Like I know what the shadows are going to look like on my fence out here on my birthday, right? And we find like even like my partner Anna and I, we both have the sun in the sign of Scorpio. Like it's the only time of the year, well, one of two times, the other's in Aquarius time, where the sun actually rises in our bedroom window. It's like
Yeah.
sometimes you just happen into these experiences that help you get aligned. I've seen people build houses that are aligned to like their natal rising sign in really amazing ways. So, and when we do this intentionally and reconnect, then we can really serve as trees, right? Reaching for the heavens and rooting into the earth. And this is such an important thing for what we are. So thank you so much, Mark. It's great to see you. I look forward to the next time we can connect in this way. And I really look forward to the day that you and I are able to be under the stars together somewhere on earth. And I'm sure it will happen.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on this today. Many blessings to you all for this, rebirth of the sun. And I look forward to coming back in another time.
Right on. So, friends, find Mark Elmy at the4pillars.net. You can find him at YouTube. You can find me at geminibrett.com. And we thank you for tuning in. Merry solstice to you. Happy Yule, whatever it is.